Hi there, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar that is part of the Wisconsin After School Network Summer Series program. Now, if you're watching this video, chances are you've been hired to work within your organization, a camp or something connected to an after-school program, before-school program, or other school program option. This webinar series is on Risk Management 101, and this is kind of like the overview of what risk management actually is. Navigating risk for youth programs. My name is Kathy Shader, and I'm a consultant with the Wisconsin After School Network, and I've been working with Juan for the past about 13 years or so in this capacity, working with programs and doing professional development on a variety of different seminars or different topics. This session in particular, or my background, why I'm doing this session, my background actually started in camp and youth development. As a young college student, I was actually a counselor at camp, working for a residential camp program in northern Wisconsin. And then I spent several years directing another camp program and several years working for the American Camp Association in professional development, working with camp directors all across the country. I have a passion for risk management. In particular, I do a lot of work around risk management and aquatics risk management. We're not going to get that specific with today's webinar, but that's kind of my background. And I love the camp experience. I love the fact that you all are doing this work. I don't work directly in camp programs any longer, but I do work with a lot of camp programs and consulting work that I do. And so the work you do is critically important to the kids that are in your care and working with you in these programs as well. So today's session on risk management, although it sounds like kind of a hefty topic, and it is a hefty topic when we talk about risk management. It can be when we think about the safety and security of everyone within your program. That includes kids and staff and counselors and volunteers and visitors, anyone associated with your program. So why you need to care, I think this program actually really is a symbol of that. The kids in your program, you want to have fun. Absolutely 100%. It's probably why you were drawn to do what you were doing right now. But we want to do that in a really safe and strategic way. And so it's really important to listen to this. And some of this might get a little bit heady in some ways when we talk about risk management. Sometimes it's like watching paint dry. So I'm going to ask you to hang on as we go through kind of this 101 on what risk management actually is, why it's important, and what you really need to be paying attention to in the position in which you hold. Now, some of you may be direct frontline staff. You work right with the kids. You have a group of kids that you're responsible for. You might have more of a leadership role within your organization. You might be a program staff. You might be just teaching an activity. Whatever it is that you do, or you could be a brand new day camp director working for the first time in your program. Risk management should be part of the foundation of the work that you do every single day. Your camp and organization provides policies and procedures, and those aren't there to frustrate you, but they are there to keep participants safe. So policies are only as good as they are followed. And so we get a real disconnect when policies are in place, yet some of the staff don't follow them. And so risk management, that's all part of this risk management that we are talking about today. So let's take a peek at what I'm talking about. So why risk management is important. This is a little bit different than why you should really care about it, but here's why it's important. So here's an example. Last year, we saw unprecedented wildfires in multiple Canadian provinces north of the United States border, right? We were impacted by that to the point where the DNR actually advised limiting outdoor activities due to Canadian wildfire smoke. That's risk consideration when we think about those things, right? So when something like this happens, paying attention to things and caution and reports that come out from organizations like the Department of Natural Resources helps us understand how we can make and create a safe environment for kids. So if the option was you couldn't go outside last year because the smoke was way too heavy to have good air quality, you had to kind of pivot, right? That's a risk mitigation thing that you or your organization did. Or even if you weren't in a camp program, I would suspect somehow you might have had to have altered your activity in some way because there was an unhealthy aspect to being outdoors. And so risk management is important so that we keep everybody safe in some way to the best of our ability. Okay. So that's why this conversation around risk management today is really important. So what we're trying to do is minimizing risk to maximize potential, or what I call maximizing potential. So in this picture, you see two small boys playing near the water. That's great in this situation, but are there risk considerations around this? There might be, but it really is about creating this positive, safe experience for the kids in your program, for all of you as staff, to be able to create, again, a safe environment, but to have a fun experience. And so when I say maximizing potential, when we don't minimize risk, things tend to happen. And so then people kind of get off track and off focus of what they're actually in your program to actually do. So we minimize the risk to maximize potential, whether it's your kids or your peers or yourself or other people who are involved in the program. So let's talk about what this actually means. Youth development programs assume a responsibility for all program participants. And when I say youth development programs, I don't just mean the camp director, the board, the organization, the club, the Y, whatever it is. It's not the entity, although they do assume that responsibility. Everybody working in a program has some level of responsibility for the participants in your program, and that includes you. And that's not to weigh down on you. It's just to help you understand that everybody's got a responsibility for keeping everybody safe. Because what we want to do is be able to have fun with our kiddos in our program, so that they can get the best experience, and you can get the best experience as part of what you're doing this summer. So I'm going to talk about some different topics about what we talk about in camp programs, and so different kind of definitions of what we're talking about. Camp programs, youth programs, when we take responsibility for other people's kids, whether they're parents, guardians, or however that plays out. When you take responsibility, and you being hired as a staff member in your program have a responsibility, as does your camp director, as does your organization, for what we call in loco parentis. So here's a quiz for you, okay? In loco parentis means a local parent in place of the parent, or a crazy parent. I want you to think about that for about 10 seconds. So if you had to choose, what does in loco parentis mean? A local parent in place of the parent, or a crazy parent? When we look at in loco parentis, that's actually Latin for in place of the parent. And so what it means essentially is that we are making decisions and taking responsibility in place of the parent who has entrusted us as an organization, trusted you as a staff member, to take responsibility for the safety of their kids. Okay, that's an important responsibility, and it's great that you are able to do that in place of that parent, right? It's just an understanding to know that oftentimes when we think about risk and risk reduction in programs, we want to think about it as if we were, and I know a lot of you are young and you're not there yet, you don't have kids yet, but if you were, or you were babysitting for somebody else, whatever it might be, if you were responsible, and you are responsible, how do you think about things you might do with these kids, or situations that kids might get into, or you might get into, that would have a negative impact? And so we want to minimize risk as best that we can. And so we always want to think about this as if we were in place of the parent, which we are. So that's the first definition. Now, let's talk a little bit about liability. So liability essentially means, I like this definition. This is from Merriam-Webster, by the way. I didn't get that actually on the I didn't get it on the slide. However, this comes from Merriam-Webster. So when we talk about liability, what does that really mean? It's the quality or state of being liable. Well, what does liable actually mean? So liable is an adjective. Basically, it means organizations are responsible. Then you can be held liable or responsible if something happens within an organization. And, truth of fact is, things happen in camp programs. And so our job is to kind of be on the front end of that and try to mitigate and minimize that liability in some way, right? So what do organizations do? Organizations put together what they call a risk management plan. Now, I'm going to credit the American Camp Association for this particular graphic. This graphic comes from the new director orientation. So I'm borrowing that, but I think it's a really good summary in relationship to what we do. oftentimes organizations have to identify what those risks are, right? So if you think of like just your day-to-day, every day, let's just say you're walking from where you live to the corner coffee shop to go get a coffee in the morning and then go on with your day, right? Think about some of the risks if you're in an urban area or any kind of area with traffic. What are some of the risks you want to identify, right? In this situation, if you were walking to get coffee, if I were walking to get coffee, I do this often from where I work. I walk across the street to the local coffee shop. I want to think about the traffic, right? So I'm thinking about traffic that might be coming. Do they have a stop sign? Do I have a right of way? So I'm identifying those risks. And then I'm assessing, right? That's the piece. I'm assessing if I have a right of way, if they have a right of way, and analyzing what it is I need to do. And so then we create this kind of plan of action, right? So that plan of action in terms of your organization that you're working for, oftentimes those plans of action come under policies and procedures. A lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are really fit under policies and procedures. And then we implement those, right? So you have a handbook you were given from your organization, I presume. Every camp organization typically has a handbook. In that handbook are a variety of different rules and regulations or policies and procedures that the camp really wants you to follow, not just read and then put aside, but really follow. And so that's the implementation piece of this. Okay, so again, like I said earlier, policies are only as good as they are implemented and followed. You can have a policy in place, but if you as the staff member choose to not follow it, that can open you up for a liability and it can open you up for what we would call a risk exposure. And I'll talk about what that means in a moment. Okay, so again, policies and procedures, that's the plan of action. Implementation, that's how people follow those policies and procedures. And then we measure, control, and monitor that. How well is it working? Is there something going on that we need to make a modification and adjustment to it? As a frontline staff member, that's not necessarily your responsibility. That really falls to camp professionals or your camp directors, your program directors to be able to do those pieces of it. But I think it's really helpful to have an awareness of this type of cycle to understand a risk management plan and why that's important in your organization. And again, I won't hit this too hard. Policies and procedures are in place. Those are the plans of action, and they're only as good as they're actually followed. So as much as sometimes it can sometimes seem restrictive, sometimes that is the case. We would choose to do different things if we were on our own time in our own space. But camps have these in place for a reason, and it's part of the risk management plan. Okay, so there are 3 areas of risk that you want to be aware of, 2 in particular that really impact you and your role within your organization as you are working directly with kids in what we would call direct service, right? The first one is human. These are any individual's population that is involved in your program. And again, it can mean your campers, it can mean staff members, it can mean volunteers, board members through a board of the directors. It can mean anyone who's actually connected to your program in some way, okay? The second piece of this is the property, right? So in this example, we've got a picture of a minivan in a car, right? So oftentimes programs, camp programs, youth programs have vehicles that they work with. So that's one part of the property. It could be if you're in a resident program, might be cabins. If you're in like a day camp program, this might just be the space that your organization provides you in some way, but there's property involved in that. So think of like bathrooms, or you can think of anything that's part of your organization, part of the property, et cetera. The third piece of this in this area of risk really comes under the financial side of it. Now, this is probably more for camp directors and executive directors to consider around the financial side of it. But I will tell you that if you have some sort of, let's see, camp store, canteen program where there's some sort of a monetary transaction in some way, even if it's just writing down what kids actually buy and what they spend or what staff buy and spend, there's a financial area of risk for that, right? So let's say your organization had cash, totally fine to use. If your kids are bringing, let's say like, $10 a week or $20 a week or something that they're putting in the camp bank, and then they're utilizing that, there's an area of risk for money that's actually transacted within the program, like something like the camp store. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the financial side of it. the big areas you want to think about are the kind of the human side, the people side of this, and the property side of this, are the ones that probably will most impact you in the work that you do. So I mentioned this earlier, risk exposure. So what is a risk exposure? A risk exposure is the vulnerability or the potential loss of an individual, organization, or asset to adverse events or uncertainty. Okay, so an exposure means that essentially, like, there are things you can put in place. And in this example, what I like about this picture, right, aquatic side of me, what I like about this picture is that I love, this is a top-seated kayak, right? And so the mitigation side on the risk side of this would tell this individual to be wearing a life jacket or a personal flotation device. This individual doesn't seem like they actually have that on. It's why I like the photo. The exposure is the fact that, let's say, for some reason, this guy pitches over and all of a sudden he's not wearing a life jacket. The craft gets away from him, and then all of a sudden something else might happen, right? That's the unseen, the adverse event, or the uncertainty. Then he might be in a whole lot more problem or a whole lot more trouble in relationship to that. So the risk exposure is what we're trying to minimize in the best way that we can. So in this situation, it's actually fairly easy to minimize the risk exposure that this individual has. Just needs to put on a life jacket. It's that simple. So as you're thinking about the activities that you operate, you might want to look through your policies and procedures and say, what is my camp doing? What kind of policies do they have that might help us minimize that risk exposure? And we're going to walk through a couple different exercises about how you can think about risk in different ways and what you might want to do. Okay. Before I get there, I just want to talk briefly about a risk exposure chart. Again, this is probably something more camp directors will do more than like frontline staff, those of you working directly as counselors with your kids. But you're going to do a risk assessment. And we can, as staff members, we can do this easily. Like if my job is to teach archery, I do a risk assessment every time I walk onto the archery range. Okay, I'm actually looking to make sure that all my boundaries are up, that my targets are in place, that I have a backstop, that I've got a firing line, that I've got rules and procedures that the kids and the staff members who actually shoot at the archery range will follow. And so that's a risk assessment. We are putting pieces in place to minimize that risk exposure to allow us to do an activity in a safe way. Okay, so there are liabilities, and in this case, what you're looking at is like human exposures or liabilities, right? There are three things: human exposure, property exposure, financial exposure. In this example, this might be, if we look at the maintenance side of this, right, there might be broken equipment. So if I walked up and all of a sudden I noticed that my bow was really fraying, and I'm doing a spot check before my campers even come up to shoot at the archery range. If I notice that the bowstring is fraying, I'm either going to take that bow out of service until I get that bowstring replaced, or I'm not going to do the activity if all the bowstrings look that way, right? That's an extreme example, but it is an example of how you can do risk assessment every time you step into whatever program that you're doing. And whatever you're doing, volleyball probably doesn't have quite as much risk exposure. Although there are certain things to think about. If you have uneven ground, if somebody's apt to turn an ankle, if the gophers have been doing crazy things and digging holes and that kind of thing, or the camp dog was doing something like that. So those are the things you just want to assess to make sure it's a safe space to do what you need to do. And again, follow those policies and procedures. Okay. Let's talk about another example. So this is risk assessment, storing day camp lunches. And this is going to come up in a moment as well. But if you're a day camp program, right? So if you require your staff and your campers to bring their lunch, you might think about a risk assessment and trying to minimize that risk exposure by requiring a couple things. One, do they have a cooler bag? Two, do you recommend that they put an ice block in it, or they put some sort of freeze? An ice block is the easiest example, right? But something to keep it cold. Or three, do you as a camp have the opportunity to refrigerate lunches prior to lunch? So if your kids arrive, let's say at 8:30 in the morning, but you're not having lunch till 11:30 or 12, what are you going to do with those lunches in the meantime? Or does your camp have a policy in place that says no refrigerator parents should not provide a refrigerated, let's say it's peanut butter and jelly versus something that would have to be refrigerated. So those are some things to think about in relationship to that. It's how you store day camp lunches, or the things you might require for day camp lunches for your kiddos to bring to camp, as well as your staff. Don't forget about the staff. That's an important piece too. Okay. So mitigating risk, all we are talking about is how we minimize it, right? So there are 4 ways that we can mitigate the risk. 1, we can avoid an activity or something altogether, right? So something might be such a high risk that we actually don't even want to do it. Okay, so we're just not even going to do it. So, or we can retain that risk, especially if the risk is pretty low and the severity of what might actually come out is pretty low. And so from a property standpoint, the easiest explanation I have for this one, we're going to retain a risk. So how many of you have screen doors or screens somewhere, a window, something like that, where your kids are pushing in and out of a door, right? Screens break pretty easy when a hand goes through. Typically, if I put my hand through a screen door, I'm probably not going to get hurt. I might get scrapes, something like that, but I'm probably not going to get severely hurt. So that's a low severity, but it typically, it can be pretty high. It can happen pretty frequently in camp programs, right? So I'm just going to retain that risk and go, I can afford to replace the screen. It's not really a huge severity to this. And so I'm just going to retain that. So your camp programs probably retain, and they're just going to replace that screen. So that's retention, right? So we can avoid it, or we can retain it if it's really low in severity and really low in frequency. It doesn't happen very often, or high in frequency, and either low or high in frequency, it can happen that way. We can reduce the opportunity for risk. And so, anytime we can reduce risk in some way, one of the ways we reduce risk is that we can actually hire, let's say, lifeguards if you're going to do swimming, right? So everybody has a different swimming ability, no matter what it is. But to really reduce the risk, we still want people to be able to participate in the activity in the pool. We're going to reduce it by providing lifeguards. So if in the event that something happens, that somebody gets really uncomfortable in the water, or drinks water, or just gets in literally over their head, we reduce that risk by providing qualified, certified lifeguards to be able to supervise those activities while those activities are taking place. And the last thing we can do is we can actually transfer that risk. Now, when we transfer that risk, an easy way to do that is like we buy insurance for the vehicles within our program, right? Or if I'm going out on an activity, let's say I'm going horseback riding with my kids. My camp doesn't provide that, but let's say I'm going to the local stables and we're going to go horseback riding. I'm transferring the risk to an organization who provides qualified, certified staff that are able to teach kids or take kids in a riding activity, who are responsible for the animals, who are responsible for the equipment, who are responsible for the supervision. So I transfer that by engaging in an agreement with an organization to actually hold that activity for my program, right? So those are 4 ways that you can think about how you might mitigate that risk. So let's talk a little bit about what you would do in a couple of different scenarios, okay? So remember, you can reduce the risk, you can retain the risk, you can avoid that risk, or you can transfer that risk, right? So some of these decisions will come to you. Some of these decisions might come to your camp director. It just depends on the organization and how you're structured. But let's talk a little bit about it. And remember, you don't have to choose just one, right? So I might retain a risk, but I might also transfer some risk, or reduce a risk and then still retain a risk. And so you can choose a couple different ways to mitigate that risk. So I want you to be prepared to think about how you're going to mitigate the risk to still provide the service, the function, whatever it is you're trying to provide, right? At the end of the day, let's say something breaks on the ropes course, right? If you have a ropes course, or you go to a ropes course, and let's say one of the cables actually kind of snaps, more than likely I'm going to avoid that risk. I'm going to stop doing the activity until I can get it repaired so that it's a safe activity to do again, right? So that's another example. If it's a minimal thing, what I'm going to do is still do some sort of a challenge activity with these kids, but maybe not up on a high ropes. Okay, let's talk about some examples for you. A bear walks into a bar. I'm just kidding. It sounds like a bad joke, but let's say a nuisance bear has been spotted coming closer to the local park where you have been taking, or you've taken a group of campers. How might you mitigate this risk? What would you do? I want you to think about reducing, retaining, avoiding, and transferring, and then we'll talk about it momentarily. You can always pause the video if you want more time. So let's talk about it. So let's say a bear has been spotted coming closer to the local park. You may not have seen this bear, but you've heard this. Let's say that you're in a state park and a DNR ranger comes up and says, just so you're aware that we've spotted a bear in the local area. They will do things, the organization will do things, the state park will do things to try to mitigate that risk. They might tell you to stay where you are. They might tell you to do something different. In this situation, you might, one, see if your camp has policy in relationship to something of an uncertain event like this. Or, if the ranger is not overly concerned, you can stay where you are, but be aware of it. Or you could say, let's go choose a different location and put all of your kids. So I can avoid the risk by staying where I am. I can retain the risk knowing that it's probably not a problem because it's on the other side of the park and that's 5 miles away, and I think we're okay. And you have clear communication with the organization as well. So there are a couple things you can do in this situation related to that. So there are always different things you can always do in these situations. Okay, second one. You want to take your older campers kayaking on the Wolf River, but your program doesn't have any aquatics programs or certified staff. What do you do to mitigate risk for participants in this activity? Think about that for 15 seconds, and I'm going to come back and talk about it. And again, if you want to, you can pause while you're kind of writing out a response if that's your choice, and then come back. Okay, in this situation, ideally what you want to do, if this is really what you want to do, and even though you might have heard that somebody's like, hey, I've got 3 kayaks at home and you could take these kids out on the water, certainly not a direction you want to go. What we want to do in this situation is we're either going to not do it, right? Even if we might have access to the equipment, we don't have certified staff, somebody who knows the river, somebody who's qualified to take us down the water, those types of things, right? So I can avoid it, or I can transfer that risk, meaning I'm going to hire an organization. Let's say it's a river outfitter that's close to the Wolf River. My organization, my camp, might hire that organization that has the qualified, certified staff, not just lifeguards. And in this situation, when we're talking about moving water, there's a different level of certification that one needs to be able to safely and securely get people down the water. In that way. So I'm going to transfer that risk to a third party, what we would call a third party organization, to basically an outfitter that can provide the equipment, they provide the staff, they provide the instruction, they provide the risk management, they will give you policies and procedures to follow. In this situation, they're actually, everybody's got helmets on because this is moving whitewater in that way. So we transfer that risk. Okay, that's the biggest thing. We can either avoid it or we can transfer it. I certainly wouldn't do it if I don't have the qualified staff. I certainly wouldn't do it even if I had access to the equipment without the qualified staff in place to be able to do it. Okay, last example, and this ties into our original conversation around the day camp lunches. Your program has a refrigerator to keep all the camp lunches in for your day camp. At 11 a.m., you happen to open the fridge to find the temperature is at 70 degrees. This is way too warm to store food safely. What are your options, right? Let's say you've got 50 kids in your camp program. It's a lot of kids. That's a lot of that's a lot of kids with a lot of lunches that might be actually in your refrigerator. What are your options? So I want you to think about it. Do you want to reduce it, retain it, avoid it, or transfer it? Think about that. Okay, and again, you can pause if you want to think about this longer. But in this situation, I'm going to avoid probably what is already in the fridge. So now I've got 50 lunches that have been in the fridge, and now I got to figure out. I certainly wouldn't allow anyone to eat whatever was actually in there unless it was something like that didn't need refrigeration. Right now, there are pros and cons to that, but ideally in this situation, you're actually going to refer to your policies. You're also going to talk to your program director, your camp director, going, what are our options? However, let's say you had a cooler that this got warm enough and you were out in a state park with them, what would you kind of do? And so you need to think about different options for maybe not allowing kids or staff to eat what is actually in this warm space, and then somehow provide another additional option in relationship to that, right? So avoid what is already there, reduce the and minimize the way to what you might provide, and then you might actually have to strategize with your program and organization to figure out how we might get everybody to lunch on this particular day because of this issue, right? Again, we're minimizing the risk exposure. If you were to allow kids to eat something that has been stored at this high level temp, there's a real strong possibility that you could end up with like a foodborne illness, something like that. That's the stuff you want to avoid. So take the safest route. When we're talking risk management, you always want to kind of take the safest route. Okay, I want to talk with you briefly about what we would call a near miss. Now, a near miss is a potential hazard or incident in which no property was damaged, no personal injury was sustained, but where given a slight shift in time or position, damage or injury could have easily occurred. In other words, one little tweak to what actually happened might have turned out a different outcome and maybe a bad outcome. So near misses may also be referred to as close calls, near accidents, or injury-free events, right? This actually comes from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA. In this situation, I want to qualify this, right? I use this as a capsized boat because I think it's one of those situations we don't expect it to, well, we hopefully don't expect it to happen, but it does happen. He's mitigating risk right now because he's got a PFD on, so that's good. But should this have turned out differently and the winds were a lot higher, or there was another boat involved where the two boats actually might have collided, that could have turned out something really different. Doesn't mean you can't do these activities, but we want to pay attention to near misses. So now I'm actually going to share a story with you. When fun turns frantic, right? So how near misses can inform your risk response. This is really important to know and understand. And so part of this as a staff member is understanding if something happens, your camp director might not be aware that this actually happened. So my third year as a counselor at camp, we were out doing an activity, which was a long time activity back in the, it's going to date me a little, but back in the 70s when environmental awareness and Earth Day was formed and those types of things, it was really popular for camp programs to really want to take their kids out and experience different parts of the environment. And in my camp in particular, what they would do is they would go bog jumping, right? Now, a bog is actually, it's kind of like a swamp, but it acts a little bit differently. These are kind of like floating mats. If you've been in northern Wisconsin, some of you may have seen this. They're kind of floating mats, right? They're squishy and they bounce. You see the open water in this picture. Like, this is a picture of a bog in northern Wisconsin, and I actually think this is in northern Michigan, but so they kind of float. And so the intent was to kind of jump to different areas, right? So I'm going to annotate this for a minute and show you all. And let's see, like this area here, right, is an area where we would have kids over here and we would have kids over here. We'd have staff. There were two of us. There were two counselors. And the intent was to jump from here to this side, and the operative word being jump, right? And so I had a co-counselor, and we probably had 10 kids in our cabin, and we were having a blast. Kids were getting dirty and messy, and they were just having a ball. Today, we probably wouldn't do this to protect the environment more. But in this situation, this was my third summer as a camp counselor. And so not everybody was over, but one of the campers actually was coming up to the edge, and she actually just stepped right into the water. This section right here, she stepped in, and when she got to about here, I was already on the ground trying to reach down because she went completely out of sight. And it was one of the scariest moments I've ever had as a counselor at camp, because this camper literally disappeared right in front of my eyes. I was a certified lifeguard. I was waterfront staff member. I was waterfront director at this time. And so my training kicked in, and as soon as she got to her, like as soon as she hit here, like she was down, like dropping down into this, I actually already was on the ground and I was reaching down, was able to reach assist and pull her out. Okay. This is an incident. She got wet. She went fully in. She said she's like she couldn't see anything, and all she saw was a hand kind of coming at her as she kind of got into the situation. So we finished the activity at that point, and so because we had this, she was just fine, and so maybe a little rattled just because of the situation. However, she was physically unharmed, and so we got everybody back. We got back to camp. We got cleaned up. And as my co-counselor and I were talking about it, is like, we need to let the directors know. And so we walked down to their house at the time, and we walked in and said, you need to know kind of this is what happened on this situation. And so the decision that camp made was we were no longer going to do this activity because it was just it was becoming unsafe, or this was an unsafe, right? This was a near miss. This is something that could have gone badly wrong that did not. However, it informed us to make different decisions in relationship to that. So near misses can inform your risk response. Don't ever hesitate to tell your camp directors or your program directors or your supervisors about something that happened in a situation, right? Better to be safe than sorry. And so it's really important. And I've been a camp director, so it's really important that I would know and understand that these things actually are going on. Part of that is to support you as a staff member, to support the campers in the program. Part of that is to understand if there are things we can do differently to make different decisions along the way, still allow for this activity. So we still hike out into these areas. My camp still hikes out into these areas. We don't do this activity, however, because it just becomes an unsafe environment to be able to do that. So that's an example that I can share with you. So let's see if I can try to minimize the annotation. Okay. I'm trying to move forward on the slide and it's not letting me do that. Okay. One moment, please. Okay, figured out how the annotations work. Okay, so that's one example I can share with you from my experience that actually happened. And it's one of those things that you just want to be cautious about. So you might, even if you've been at camp before, just think back through some things that might have happened that would be considered in your miss. Those are the things to think about of like, how would you do things differently in doing that? Okay, so that's kind of a wrap in terms of risk management 101. Again, you want to think about how you can minimize the risk to maximize potential, right? And so we want to be able to do these things in a safe way, in an effective way. You can reduce that risk, retain that risk, you can transfer that risk, or you can avoid that risk. And these are good conversations to have both as staff members collectively together and with your camp directors, with your program directors, so you're able to do have that collective conversation. Because at the end of the day, this is all about the kids in your program and providing safe space and a safe place for them to be able to come to your camp program and have fun. So with that, I'll leave it as a wrap. I hope you have a safe and successful summer. Thank you for everything you do for the kids in your program and the kids in the state of Wisconsin. Have a great day.